MyOHR's Sexual Harassment Awareness and Prevention Training. My name is Andrea Montesioca, and I am one of the HR representatives for MyOHR. Before we begin the training, please note that you should have received an email including a training packet that includes very important documents that will need to be returned to us, as well as some resources for you to look at your convenience. The first important document is the training acknowledgement form. The second is the acknowledgement of the harassment policy of the company. There's also a training evaluation in there and a quiz. If you wish to return the quiz and the training evaluation, please do so. And then there's also workplace scenarios that are included and we'll go over during this presentation. Let's begin. So welcome. Some of you may be asking, why are we here? So we are here to review the elements of sexual harassment and the remedies available to the victims of sexual harassment under both California and federal law. We will also discuss other forms of unlawful harassment and consider the strategies for preventing and responding to unlawful harassment. Lastly, we are going to address concerns regarding abusive behavior in the workplace. Some objectives that we have here today is understanding what is sexual harassment, also being familiar with the extent of personal and organization liability. We will then look at the 4 factors comprising a hostile environment. We'll talk about what is quid pro quo, how to prevent sexual harassment, and then lastly, how to report sexual harassment. So to begin, what is sexual harassment? Sexual harassment are unwelcome sexual advances, also could be requests for sexual favors. This is verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature that is explicitly or implicitly a term or condition of employment decisions. Sexual conduct that unreasonably interferes with an individual's job performance or creates any intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. Under Title VII, it prohibits discrimination in employment based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Part of this was an amendment known as the Crown Act, passed in 2020. The Crown Act is where an individual cannot be discriminated against for their hairstyle or texture if it is associated or based on a particular race. The courts have also interpreted discrimination based on sex to include sexual harassment. Sexual harassment under the Fair Employment and Housing Act, also known as FEHA, prohibits harassment and discrimination in employment because of race, color, religion, hair texture or style, sex, gender, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, marital status, national origin, ancestry, mental and physical disability, medical condition, age, pregnancy, denial of medical and family care leave, or pregnancy disability. FEHA defines harassment because of sex as including sexual harassment, gender harassment, and harassment based on pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions. Now, who is protected by the law? These are employees, applicants, contractors, volunteers, and unpaid interns. Now, who is liable under the law? Personal liability of the harasser is the individual harasser is personally liable for damages caused by their unlawful actions. Now, for the liability of the employer, this is an employer is liable for the unlawful harassment by its supervisors and agents. So, every employer is liable, or prospective employer. Also, every person in the workplace, right? A supervisor, a subordinate, or a coworker. Now moving towards retaliation. Retaliation occurs when an employer punishes an employee for engaging in legally protected activity. Now, some examples of what is protected activity can include making a complaint to a supervisor, manager, or another person designated by your employer to receive complaints about harassment. Another could be making a report of suspected harassment, even if you are not the recipient. Another could be filing a formal complaint about harassment, maybe opposing discrimination, potentially assisting another employee who is complaining of harassment, and lastly, providing information during a workplace investigation or harassment of testifying in connection with a complaint of harassment filed with a government agency or in court. Under the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008, also known as GINA, this protects Americans against discrimination based on any genetic information in health insurance and employment. So, for example, private health records are not to make determining factors of any type of employment or health insurance. Employers are not allowed to use any information they may find about a predisposition to a developing disease that a candidate or an employee may have in the future to make any type of employment decisions. This also prohibits the group health plans and health insurers from denying coverage to a healthy individual or potentially charging a higher premium based solely on a genetic predisposition to developing a disease in the future. Now, some differences between federal and California state anti-discrimination laws. We have the left-hand side for the federal and the right-hand side for California state. The protected classes on the left, under Title VII, we have race, color, religion, sex, including pregnancy, national origin, hair texture, or style. We also have another protected class under GINA for genetic information. We have also the ADEA, age 40 years or older, and the ADA for those with disabilities. Now, on the federal side, employers with 15 or more employees in 1 year must comply with Title VII, the ADA, and GINA. Employers with 20 or more employees in 1 year must comply with the ADEA. Now, on the California state, we have protected classes, a longer list that we have than the federal. We have race, color, religion, sex, gender, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, marital status, national origin, hair texture, style, ancestry, mental and physical disability, medical condition, age, pregnancy, denial of medical and family care leave, or pregnancy disability. Now, any California-based government and private employers with 5 or more employees in 1 year must comply with these anti-discrimination laws based on any of those protected classes. Now we go here and we look at federal and California state for whether or not an employer may escape liability. On the federal side, if there was no tangible employment action taken, the employer may escape liability by establishing that the employer exercised reasonable care to prevent and correct any harassing behavior, that the victim unreasonably failed to take advantage of the preventative or corrective opportunities that the employer provided. Also does not apply to independent contractors, volunteers, or unpaid interns. First is the California state. Under FIHA, employers will be held strictly liable for any harassment by their supervisors or agents. And this does actually include independent contractors, volunteers, and unpaid interns. Now, harassment based on any of the following characteristics is against the law. We have race, color, national origin, sex, sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, gender expression, religious creed, mental disability, physical disability, medical condition, military or veteran status, age, marital status, genetic characteristics, or ancestry. There's 17 of these characteristics, and any harassment based on these is against the law. Now we'll go into what is bullying. Bullying is actually a form of harassment. Remember, harassment is against the law if it's based on any of those protected classes: age, sex, race, ethnicity, etc. Bullying, however, is usually seen as acts of more so verbal comments that could quote-unquote mentally hurt or isolate a person in the workplace. Sometimes bullying can involve negative physical contact as well. Bullying usually involves those repeated incidents or a pattern of behavior that is intended to intimidate, offend, degrade, or humiliate a particular person or group of people. It has also been described as the assertion of power through aggression. Workplace bullying can in fact manifest itself in specific ways. This can involve sharing rumors about you, sharing hurtful gossip with another coworker, yelling, name-calling, mocking, insulting, or ridiculing in face-to-face confrontations. Can also include offensive photos or objects that might be placed around your work area where you're likely to see it, like a conference room or a cubicle. Can also be physical when it involves unwanted contact or gestures that are intended to intimidate or threaten someone. This can take the form usually of personal attacks that have little to do with their job or with the workplace that they are in. If you can think of some examples of verbal bullying, please take a moment to see and what you can come up with. Some examples that I came up with were taunting, teasing, maybe even name-calling. Then we have examples of bullying. So these are just a short list of what can be bullying or known as bullying. There may be way more that you may think of, but this is just a short list. So it could be excluding or isolating someone socially, intimidating a person, undermining or deliberately impeding a person's work, constantly changing work guidelines, establishing impossible deadlines that will set up the individual to fail, withholding necessary information or purposefully giving the wrong information, making jokes that are obviously offensive by spoken word or email, and intruding on a person's privacy by maybe pestering, spying, or stalking. So next we have myth or fact. A person cannot be a bully and a victim. Now I want you to take a moment and think, do you believe this is a myth or a fact? A person cannot be a bully and a victim. This is a myth. So a lot of times some bullies are perpetrating the cycle of bullying and have also been victims, also known as bully victims. Let's move on to the next one. 70% of people have been bullied in high school. Is this a myth or a fact? This is a fact. Unfortunately, 70% of people have in fact been bullied in high school. And we have the last one. Boys engage in bullying differently than girls do. Is this a myth or a fact? This is a fact. So girls are more so inclined to engage in what is known psychological bullying. So this can be verbal, relational, social, as the non-violence is more in line with gender roles of boys being more violent than girls, right? Girls like to gossip, girls like to maybe exclude one another. So this may fall more along those gender roles and what we know as what boys do and what girls do. So next off, we have abusive conduct in the workplace. So the purpose of California's required harassment training, which you're taking as we speak, is to ensure a respectful workplace. Abusive conduct in the workplace is any conduct that a reasonable person would find hostile, offensive, and unrelated to an employer's legitimate business interest. So any type of abusive conduct is not maintaining that respectful workplace. Just to keep in mind. This abusive conduct may include repeated infliction of verbal abuse, such as derogatory remarks, insults, verbal or physical conduct that any reasonable person would find intimidating, humiliating, or maybe even sabotaging, undermining a person's work performance. Behavior that might frighten, humiliate, belittle, or degrade the recipient is aggressive yelling or shouting, persistent use of abusive, insulting, or offensive language, unwarranted physical contact, negative comments about a person's appearance, lifestyle, personality, mannerisms, or family, inappropriate teasing, circulating inappropriate photos, interrupting a person's work, discounting a person's statement in a meeting, maybe blaming a person for problems they didn't cause or didn't have control of, and lastly, spreading misinformation such as rumors. Now, you may be thinking, why does this matter? This, in fact, lowers morale. It may impact productivity. It creates a distraction for employees, and it may create a fear, stress, and anxiety if an employee is worried about what somebody else might tell them or make them feel just by maybe name calling, by sharing rumors, or by gossiping about one another. And again, it can potentially have legal action remembering that personal liability and also that organization liability. Lastly, it can also create workplace violence. An example of a workplace violence case is one that we saw happen in San Jose, California, not too long ago, where a man who was the perpetrator, named Samuel James Cassidy, was a member, an employee of VTA, which is San Jose's public transportation. His wife of 10 years described him as having anger issues and often being angry at his coworkers and the company, VTA, for what he believed to be unfair work assignments. And even according to an initial review by the VTA, Cassidy had a pattern of insubordination and had gotten into verbal altercations with coworkers on at least 4 separate accounts. Though the incidents were elevated to management and he faced disciplinary action, he had never been formally disciplined for any of them. According to coworkers, Cassidy was angered over a change in policy that ended the cash payouts for unused vacation days, and in April 2021, he aired his grievances over the radio communication systems for light rail operators. Shortly after that, in May 26, 2021, Cassidy actually decided to leave his home around 5:39 a.m. after setting it on fire. At 6:30 a.m., he opened fire onto his coworkers at VTA. The shooting occurred in 2 separate buildings at the busiest time of day during a shift change between employees when there were over 100 people present. He killed 10 people and then shot and killed himself. So we see here that this grievance, this, anger that this perpetrator had towards the company and his the members of management pushed Samuel to go and create this chaos, this workplace violence, and ultimately ended up hurting and killing a lot of people through the process. Right? We want to make sure that we're creating a respectful and also a safe environment for everyone, and talking about those things and getting your points across and dealing with those matters is very important. So then we have harassment based on gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. Now again, as a reminder, the purpose of this California required harassment training is to ensure that respectful workplace. In order to have that respect in the workplace, we need to be aware of the differences between these different definitions and considering when to use the words sex, gender, transgender, etc. So first off, we have sex. This is the sex assigned at birth, male or female. And then we have gender identity. This is an individual internal understanding of an identification with a particular gender. Then we have gender expression. This is how an individual expresses their gender through appearance or behavior. And then lastly, we have transgender. This is an individual whose gender identity differs from their sex assigned at birth. So Very important to remember the differences between these because they are part of those 17 protected characteristics that California law recognizes, and harassment based on any of those is against the law. So what can you do? If you believe you have been a victim of bullying or have seen bullying, we want you to feel safe reporting the issue without the fear of retaliation. It is company policy to report. We do have that open door policy, meaning that any employee is more than welcome and should feel safe reporting. And again, they won't be retaliated against. And then we also encourage you to talk to your supervisor or to human resources. So I wanted to bring up a recent sexual harassment case that is pretty interesting. It is a case dealing with the 99-cent store, and it was sexual harassment by a supervisor. So in 2018, two former employees at the 99-cent store in Redding, California, filed complaints with the DFEH alleging that their supervisor sexually assaulted them in the walk-in freezer located at the back of the store and also subjected them to other forms of sexual harassment. The women also alleged that managers at the 99-cent store subjected them to retaliation after they reported the sexual harassment, including additional scrutiny at work and a reduction of working hours. After a mandatory mediation, 99-cent store agreed to pay the complainants and the DFEH $1.2 million to resolve the claims. In addition to this monetary settlement, 99-cent store agreed to hire an independent third party to monitor and track compliance with the settlement agreement for 3 years. So managers since then would be undergoing trainings, and also the 99-cent store would have to be providing compliance reports to the DFEH for at least 3 years. So this case shows, right, that it shows that liability that the organization ended up dealing with, having to have those complaints reported, or those reports given to the DFEH, because one of their supervisors went ahead and was alleged that he subjected other employees to forms of sexual harassment. So then we have here types of prohibited harassment. This is race and color, including hair, style and texture, national origin, age, religion, disability, maybe political opinion, HIV or AIDS, sexual orientation, protected activity, or gender. Now we get into kinds of harassment. First off, we have quid pro quo, which is a Latin term meaning this for that. Then we have a hostile work environment. This is repeated unwanted acts that create that uncomfortable working environment. Then lastly, we have that tangible employment action, which was mentioned a few slides back. This is where an employee suffers a loss. So examples of quid pro quo: promising a raise or promotion for a date or sex could be an example. Punishing an employee for refusing those sexual advances. Giving an employee a poor performance review for refusing sexual advances. And saying things like, pleasing people goes a long way here, if you know what I mean. So all of those could be examples. This for that, right? You get something in exchange for sexual advances or for a date or whatever the case is. Examples of a hostile environment are telling off-color jokes, making lewd or suggestive comments, bragging about sexual prowess, questioning coworkers about their sex life, writing lewd or suggestive notes or emails, making lewd gestures, leering at someone in a sexual manner, spreading sexual rumors about coworkers, giving unwanted personal sexual gifts. Again, this is examples of a hostile environment, which could be an example of sexual harassment. And then we have a four-factor analysis. How do we know what is considered a hostile work environment? We use this to try and determine. So we want to see how severe it is. Is it threatening? Is it humiliating? What's the negative impact on the work environment? What's the frequency also of these occurrences of the unwanted behavior? Is it happening, once a week? Is it happening twice a week? Is it happening once a month? Those are all things that are part of our four-factor analysis of what makes a hostile work environment. And then we have tangible employment action. So this occurs between a supervisor and an employee. So there is a power dynamic here. We have someone who has higher power and authority, and then we have a subordinate or just an employee who may not even report to the supervisor, who has maybe a little bit less decision-making power. Here, for tangible employment action, the liability is automatic. Remember, employers will be held strictly liable if there's intangible employment action. That was part of our slide where it had the federal and California state side by side. So this was on the California state side that the liability is automatic. Some examples of this would be a cut in pay, maybe a change in workload, or a change in assignment. Sexual harassment can include verbal. So this is jokes, language, bragging about sexual prowess, inquiring about sexual behavior. We also have the visual, revealing pornographic pictures or posters, displaying those pornographic websites, right? How we said if it's somewhere in your cubicle or in a conference room, all of that can be included and constituted as sexual harassment. Can also be physical. This is one of the most common, or the one that we think about the most. The unwanted touching, the rubbing, keeping your hands to yourself is the best way to not have any of those allegations or things like that where you can be held liable for doing so. We also have the written, unwanted lewd letters, notes, or emails. And then lastly, quid pro quo, which again, tying those raises and those promotions to sexual performance. So who are the perpetrators? These are supervisors, subordinates, coworkers, clients, even customers and vendors, and those of the same sex. So in the picture that you see here, there's a man that is touching the woman's shoulder. She looks concerned on why are you doing so? And I think that is one of the most common of the perpetrators, where we see a man being the perpetrator towards a woman. But remember, it can be also a woman to a man, or it can be woman to woman, or man to man. Okay, so even those of the same sex. Then we have those who are victims. These are direct targets of harassment, and they don't just have to be direct targets. These can also be the bystanders, maybe the witnesses to the harassment, and even coworkers and subordinates. So we have here recent top sexual harassment cases. So first one here is Sexual harassment and retaliation discrimination case. So a 45-year-old surgical PA was claiming she was subjected to a hostile work environment, sexual harassment, and wrongful termination. So she was subjected to inappropriate remarks, sexual advances, and derogatory comments. When she complained about suffering and the mistreatment at the hands of other male employees, the defendant retaliated against her through defamation, false accusations, and unwarranted discipline. Then we have the second one, where Miss Alford began working at Aaron's as a customer service rep. Shortly after, a male employee began intentionally and inappropriately touching her, calling her degrading pet names, and making unwanted advances, including an incident where she pushed her onto the floor, pulled her shirt up, and actually masturbated on her. She followed company policy and tried to contact a sexual harassment hotline. She also spoke to multiple managers, but her complaints went unnoticed. She was persecuted at work, feared for her actual safety, and was not given equal opportunities when applying for a promotion. We then have the third one, where Miss Carlson, a former Fox News anchor, filed a lawsuit directly at her former boss and CEO and chairman of Fox News for sexual harassment. Her claims included retaliation, unfair compensation, sexual harassment, and emotional distress. She filed an internal complaint against Stephen Ducey for disparate treatment and harassment. Mr. Ailes retaliated against her by giving her less prestigious assignments and reducing her compensation. So during that time, he alluded to her status at Fox News in exchange for sex. She was awarded $20 million, and Fox issued an apology on Mr. Ailes' behalf. Following the lawsuit, other women then came forward alleging Mr. Ailes committed multiple acts of harassment, sexual harassment, and it was just a huge unraveling after that. So we see that this is also an example of that tangible employment action where she got a reduction of her compensation and less prestigious assignments for retaliating against her, as a result of her coming forward, he retaliated against her. And then we have, lastly, two former caretakers who refused to bare their breast to a 300-pound sign language speaking gorilla named Coco. They have settled a lawsuit against the Gorilla Foundation. Nancy Alperin and Kendra Keller claimed they were fired after they refused to expose their bosoms to the primate. And after reporting sanitary problems at Coco's home in Woodside, an upscale town south of San Francisco, the pair claimed that they were threatened that if they did not indulge Coco's nipple fetish, their employment with the Gorilla Foundation would suffer, the lawsuit alleged. So Alperin and Keller claimed that Francine, quote-unquote Penny Patterson, the gorilla's longtime caretaker and the president of the foundation, pressured them to expose their breast as a way to bond with the 33-year-old female gorilla. Lawyers for both sides refused to disclose terms of the settlement. So this one's undisclosed. We then have another example of a case of sexual harassment. So this one, the first one, has no sexual desire motivation, but it is On-Kale versus Sundowner Offshore Service. So Offshore Services was a decision of the Supreme Court of the United States. The case arose out of a suit for sex discrimination by a male oil rig worker who claimed that he was repeatedly subjected to sexual harassment by his male coworkers. So this is a male oil rig worker who is claiming that his other male coworkers subjected him to sexual harassment. The court held that Title VII, protection against workplace discrimination because of sex, applied to harassment in the workplace between members of the same sex. So this was a huge breakthrough on behalf of those perpetrators of the same sex, and was a major breakthrough in the actual Supreme Court of the United States. We then have a $34 million suit against Mitsubishi Motors. So in 1998, Mitsubishi agreed to pay $34 million to female workers at the Normal, Illinois plant, where the work environment was definitely not normal. It was very hostile. The company was charged with allowing a abusive, hostile setting for women since at least 1990. In addition to the $34 million, the company paid out several more million in individual suits. So in this case, the women were actually routinely fondled, verbally abused, and subjected to obscene jokes, behavior, and graffiti. So one male worker even fired an air gun between the female's legs. So the abusive work environment caused many women to quit, and others were simply denied promotions when they refused to grant those sexual favors. The silver lining of this is that the company has impressively cleaned up its tarnished reputation. The company immediately hired Lynn Martin, former Secretary of Labor, and Martin overhauled the anti-sexual harassment and complaint system, which now boasts a zero-tolerance policy. And then the last case that we have is Google of $310 million. So a group of shareholders accused the leadership team of mishandling employee complaints of sexual misconduct and discrimination. At the center of the lawsuit was a $90 million exit package for the Google executive Andy Rubin, creator of the Android mobile operating system, who faced a sexual harassment investigation at the time. Google's parent company, Alphabet, pledged the $310 million to expanding diversity efforts and trying to resolve the shareholder litigation. So at the end of the day, what should a victim do? Ideally, tell the harasser to stop. If you do not want to be direct and telling them, stop, I don't do that anymore, you can try and get your point across without being super direct on what you're talking about that's making you uncomfortable. But our opinion and our suggestion is to totally be direct to your harasser, saying things like, hey, this conversation's making me really uncomfortable. Do you mind if we don't speak about this anymore or ever again? If you don't feel comfortable telling the harasser to stop, or the victim doesn't feel comfortable, definitely tell a supervisor. Also, you are allowed to talk to HR, and then we can give next steps on what to do. So now, what isn't harassment? This is an overly sensitive employee, an impolite, trivial, annoying, or bothersome behavior, and is not consensual, pressure-free dating. So an overly sensitive employee would be maybe someone who is upset about a performance review, but the performance review is based solely on their work performance. That would not be harassment. Now, if the performance review had nothing to do with the employee's performance and instead has to do with their sex, then that could constitute as harassment. Now, for consensual pressure-free dating, it's important to know that consensual pressure-free dating is only when it's among subordinate and subordinate or coworkers of the same level. If a supervisor is involved with one of their subordinates or an employee of a lower level or a lesser title, then that is automatically not allowed, and the supervisor can be held liable at that point. So important to know that, because there's a power imbalance. So no supervisor should be dating any subordinate or any employee who has a lesser title. So for your anti-harassment policy, which you have in that packet that we sent out to you, it provides a uniform of expectations of what you should be doing, what should you not be saying, and also an expectation of the organization. It also protects employee rights and making sure that you are not being harassed on any of those characteristics that are protected by the law. It also fosters respect for all parties, anyone and everyone who is involved with the company. It promotes that compliance and prevention. That's the number one thing. We are trying to educate and teach everyone about prevention and trying to stay in compliance so that we do not have to, go through any type of investigation process if we're maintaining that compliance and making sure we are abiding by the law. It also defines management and employee responsibilities. So our complaint process it looks a little like this. We get a report of the actual complaint. Then there is some type of response to the individual who reported. From there, we conduct an investigation where we will talk to the accuser, we'll talk to the accused, and any bystanders or any other witnesses who may be involved. From that investigation, we then come up with a response, and if action is necessary, it will be taken, and that can be anything from, maybe taking a training course or potentially, coaching, consulting, and things like that. And then lastly, we have a resolution in response to the individual who made the initial report. Part of our intake process for our investigation and when we're just asking these questions. So we talk about what type of conduct occurred and also when did it happen. We may ask how frequently did it happen? Were there any witnesses? What was said? Was the complainant touched? If so, where? Is the complainant aware of similar behavior towards others? And was the conduct in the context of a joke or was it maybe unwelcome? So for our summary, before we end the presentation, sexual harassment again is prohibited by Title VII. Sexual harassment is conduct of a sexual nature in the workplace. Sexual harassment is unwelcome advances or requests for sexual favors or verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. Any employee and customer and clients can commit sexual harassment. To continue the summary, harassment and discrimination is prohibited by Title VII and also under the Fair Employment and Housing Act, also known as FEHA. Any employee can be the target as well as a bystander and a witness. And our company has a zero tolerance policy regarding harassment in our workplace. So now we're going to continue on is this sexual harassment workplace scenarios. So you get to be the judge of each scenario. We have about 4 of them, and I'll walk you through each of them. So scenario number 1. Wendy is the receptionist who greets all incoming guests and accepts packages. She is 25 years old and is very outgoing. She has been working in this role for 2 weeks. The local delivery driver, John, visits the office at least 3 times a week with deliveries. "Hey, you're the new receptionist," says John. "Yes, I am," smiles Wendy. "Well, you're a lot cuter than the other one," says John. "Oh," says Wendy as she laughs nervously. "Could you sign right here for me, sweetie?" "Sure. Is that all?" asks Wendy. As she hands back the stylus, John gently touches her hand and pauses. John proceeds to ask Wendy out on a date. She politely says she's not interested. John leaves and plans to woo her over. He gets a new haircut and also starts wearing cologne. When he makes a stop into the office, the driver brings candies, flowers, cards, stuffed animals, just for the receptionist about once a week. The receptionist feels uncomfortable and politely asks him to stop. So I want you to take a moment and think, is this harassment? And you have this in your packet again. So I see here a few red flags. We are seeing that is a delivery driver, right? Even though he's not an employee, he is still associated with the company. He is visiting at least 3 times a week. And as the employer, they have a responsibility to protect their employee if she feels like he is going out of his way, right, and is giving her unwanted gifts. Especially since he's touching her without her permission and making her feel, potentially a little uncomfortable. All of those are red flags that an employer should be aware about and that an employee should report. So we'll go to number 2. Casey is standing in front of the microwave, waiting patiently for his breakfast burrito, when Sue walks up behind him and yells, "Boo!" Casey then flinches and laughs. "Oh gosh, you scared me." "Good morning, Sue. How are you?" "I'm better now. I'm so tired of sitting at my desk and I want to say hi," says Sue. "Well, happy Monday, right? It's only 9:30 a.m. and we have a ways to go," says Casey. "I know. I'm glad you're here. Seriously." And Sue touches Casey's shoulders and winks at him. "Hey, Sue. I have to get going here. I'll see you around," says Casey, a bit concerned. A few hours pass by and Casey's wife comes in to drop him off some lunch. Sue sits at her desk and watches Casey and his wife talk. Shortly after his wife leaves, Sue pretends to walk by the bathroom and hears Casey talking to another coworker about his family. She then returns to her desk and waits for Casey to return to his. She sends him an email about how her boyfriend just broke up with her and she's feeling very heartbroken. Sue watches Casey go back to his desk. She then pretends to sniffle and wipes her eyes with tissues. Casey turns around and asks, "Hey, I just got your email. I'm sorry to hear that." "Oh, Casey, you're so nice. Thank you so much." As Sue says this, she gets up to sit on Casey's desk, touches his leg, and talks about her past relationships. So I want you to think about this scenario number 2 and think, is this harassment? And then why or why not? So some major red flags that I would like to point out is Sue looking, right, leering. Sue maybe can even be considered stalking Casey as he's walking by, as his wife comes in and she's just sitting at her desk, looking at them. And she's obviously trying to get his attention, but it's the fact that this can be considered potentially stalking definitely raises red flags. We'll go on to number 3. Mary has been working in an upscale restaurant in San Francisco for years. She recently changed shifts and is now working the morning and lunch shifts only instead of dinner. She tries to familiarize herself with the hostess and a few other servers there. One of the executive chefs, Evan, noticed that Mary was getting ready to make a few orders and he decides to help her. "Hey, I feel like I've seen you before. I think you work the night shift, or used to?" asked Evan. "Yes, I have to work mornings because I have to take care of my mother at night," says Mary. "Well, I'm glad you're working mornings because Pedro doesn't make great omelets," laughed Evan. Mary smiled and she proceeded to wash a few bowls and made sure all the frying pans were cleaned. The next day, the restaurant opened. The kitchen staff were becoming busy with orders coming in. Mary seemed to juggle making all the food and getting the food out on a timely manner. Evan saw Mary about to step onto an area with some water and ran towards her and held her waist. "Watch out, Mary!" "Oh, wow, I didn't even see that," said Mary. "I'm glad I caught you," said Evan. "Is your back okay?" asks Evan as he begins to lightly massage her lower back. "Yeah, it's okay, Evan. I'm fine," said Mary. She stands up and she's feeling uncomfortable with Evan's behavior. "Are you sure? You should probably sit down. Here, let me grab a chair for you." As Evan turns around, Mary has disappeared. So what do we think? Is this harassment or not? So a few red flags that I see here is Evan is the executive chefs, so I'm assuming he has a management role, and he is putting his hands on his subordinate employee. The potential liability can be automatic at that point if he's touching her without her permission and even starting to massage her lower back. So this can definitely be a red flag. And then we have scenario number 4. Allie has just came back from maternity leave. She was welcomed back warmly and missed by all her coworkers. Henry, her manager, decided to personally welcome her back by inviting her to his office. They both have a nice conversation about family and how fast the kids grow up. A few weeks later, Allie came into work an hour late because she had to take care of her daughter in the morning. As she hurried through her desk, she began to respond to emails and file some papers away. At lunchtime, sandwiches were catered and placed in a conference room for a company-sponsored lunch event. Henry sat next to Allie and decided to make jokes about lactation and making yo mama jokes throughout lunch. Allie felt uncomfortable and embarrassed. "I mean, if you're going to be late, at least double check your buttons to make sure they're buttoned all the way," said Henry sarcastically. "I'm sorry, I was just leaving in a rush," explained Allie. "Yeah, let me help you, Mama," jokingly said Henry, and he started reaching toward her. "No, I'd rather you not. Please don't touch me," said Allie. Everyone at lunch was quiet and looked away as things started to get awkward. What do we think here? So automatically, some red flags. Henry is Allie's manager, and he should definitely not be making lactation jokes because being pregnant or anything pregnancy related is definitely protected under anti-discrimination laws. And also, he should not be touching her, trying to unbutton or trying to button up her shirt. So all of those are red flags. So now we have a quiz portion of is it harassment? Number 1, HR doesn't need to investigate if an employee complains that a coworker texted offensive photos to their personal device outside of work hours. This is false. Companies can be held accountable for their workers' behavior regardless of where and when the potential harassment occurred, and whether the offensive content appeared on the employee's own phone or tablet. Number 2, a hospital can be held liable for the inappropriate behavior of its patients. This is in fact true. The fact that sexual harassment can be perpetrated by a company's clients, customers, or any other segment of the public with whom they interact often gets overlooked. For example, suppose a patient is being suggestive to the nurse that's serving the floor in his hospital, and the healthcare worker subsequently reports the behavior to the supervisor. The hospital now has an obligation to protect this person from sexual harassment. Number 3, if an employee repeatedly makes sexual jokes near their cubicle and no one involved in the conversation complains, the company bears no responsibility. This is false. Such behavior might be okay at a private happy hour if no one has a problem with it. However, it's totally different if it occurs in an area where everyone can hear it, like a lunchroom or an open workspace. And finally, to just wrap up, please report complaints right away. You should keep things as confidential as possible so that there's no rumors or gossip that's being spread about what's being complained about or reports that are being made. And then lastly, no employee will be retaliated against for bringing forth those good faith complaints. Thank you so much. And here is our contact information from MyOHR. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And again, you will need to return those signed acknowledgement forms to us, and we will be waiting in order to send you your certificate of completion. Thank you.